The nursing home told me I wasn't allowed to see my grandmother. Not today, not this week, but until she was stable again. They said she was no longer mentally fit to interact with family, but that same night, I received a letter. No stamp, no nursing home seal. And if what they said was true, then the person who wrote that letter shouldn't exist. For 2 years, every update about my grandmother came through someone else. I never heard her voice. I was never allowed to ask her what she wanted. I wasn't even allowed to see her. Everything was explained with the same reason. She had lost her mind. The nursing home said they were protecting her. My family said I should trust the doctors, and I did, until that letter appeared. Not as a cry for help, but as proof that something was deeply wrong and happening right now. The first time the nursing home refused me, they did it gently. "She's in a stabilization phase," the receptionist said. "Visits aren't recommended right now." I stood at the front desk, staring at the plastic name badge and the professionally trained smile. No one said I was banned. No one raised their voice, but the answer was still no. I asked when I could come back. "We'll reach out." They always said that. For the past 2 years, every update about my grandmother had come through someone else. Sometimes it was my aunt, sometimes the facility manager, sometimes a doctor I had never met. They all agreed on one thing: she wasn't mentally fit anymore. Too much interaction would upset her. It was better to keep things quiet. I believed them. I told myself silence was respect. Until that day. The night I was denied a visit for the 3rd time that month, my phone rang. A landline number. No caller ID. It rang exactly 3 times, then stopped. I called back. No answer. The next morning, I found an envelope slid under my apartment door. No stamp, no return address, no facility markings, just my name, handwritten. The writing was shaky, but unmistakable, familiar enough that I would have recognized it with my eyes closed. I stood in the hallway holding it, with the strange feeling that I was holding something that wasn't supposed to exist. Because if what they had been telling me was true, she couldn't have written this. I opened the letter in my kitchen while the kettle was still boiling. Inside was a single lined page. The handwriting wasn't neat, but the thoughts were clear, direct, focused. She asked if I still had her old brown coat. She mentioned the bank by its old name, the one she'd always used, even after it rebranded. She warned me not to trust anyone who spoke on her behalf, not even family. Then came the final line. "If you're reading this, it means they told you I'm no longer in my right mind." I read that sentence again and again.
Not because it was confusing, but because it was too clear. That afternoon, I went back to the nursing home. This time, I didn't ask permission. I stood at the end of the hallway, looking through the glass into the common room. I saw her. She was sitting in a wheelchair, back straight, hands resting neatly in her lap, eyes open. She wasn't talking. She wasn't looking around, but she wasn't empty either. Nothing like the version they had described to me. As soon as I stepped closer, a staff member moved in front of me. "I'm sorry," she said. "She's not allowed visitors." I asked why. "Family directive." Family. I asked if my grandmother knew I was there. The staff member glanced at her, then lowered her voice. "We follow what's in the file." That night, I called my aunt. She told me I was overreacting, that doctors had confirmed my grandmother no longer had decision-making capacity, that all matters now went through her legal guardian. I asked who the guardian was.
There was a brief pause, then an answer that sounded rehearsed. "That's not important." I folded the letter and slipped it into my jacket pocket. For the first time, I realized that in 2 years, no one had shown me a single original document. No diagnosis, no independent evaluation, no signature from my grandmother herself. Just explanations, and very polite resistance. The next morning, I returned to the facility early. I said I only wanted to drop something off for her, a light jacket. The manager accepted it, logged it, and placed it in a locked cabinet. I asked when she'd receive it. "We'll deliver it when appropriate." As I stood up to leave, the manager added, still calm, still courteous,
You shouldn't try to contact her directly anymore. It's not good for her. I walked out of the nursing home with a sudden clarity. My grandmother was still alive, but everything around her was being arranged to prove that her voice no longer mattered.
And the letter in my pocket was no longer just a message. It was a refusal to disappear.
I didn't tell anyone about the letter, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped pushing and just watched. For 2 years, everything about my grandmother had been filtered before it reached me. I wanted to understand how that filter worked when I wasn't making noise behind it. So I started small. I called the nursing home without giving my name and asked about their process for determining mental capacity. The woman on the phone answered smoothly, like she'd repeated the same explanation countless times. Doctors evaluate. Records are kept internally. Family makes the final call. I asked whether relatives could review the original evaluation. There was a pause, very brief. Usually that isn't necessary. I asked who signed off in the end. The file has all the required signatures, she said. You can rest assured. I hung up with a familiar feeling. Every answer sounded correct, but none of them actually said anything.
The next day, I called my aunt. I told her I wanted to speak directly with the doctor. No accusations, no arguments, just a conversation. She laughed, softly, evenly, the kind of laugh you use when you think someone is misunderstanding something obvious. You're exhausting yourself, she said. Everything has already been handled. I asked who decided that my grandmother couldn't see me. The doctor advised it, she replied. We're just following instructions. I asked if I could see that recommendation in writing. Her tone shifted, just slightly. Don't you trust me? The question landed exactly where it was meant to, not to be answered, but to shut down everything that came after it. I stayed quiet. She continued, faster now. You're not here taking care of her every day. You don't see her confused episodes. Don't let some meaningless letter make you question everything. A meaningless letter. That night, I took the letter out again. I didn't reread it. I studied the handwriting.
The spacing between lines, the way she underlined certain words, a spelling mistake she had made for years without fail. Those habits don't disappear just because someone decides to label you mentally unfit. Through an old contact, I reached out to someone who used to work at the nursing home. She had left almost a year earlier. We met at a small cafe a few blocks away. I didn't ask her about my grandmother directly. I asked, do they often limit family visits? She glanced around, then lowered her voice. Only when the family requests it. I asked why they would. Usually it's for the patient's well-being, she said. But sometimes it's just more convenient. Convenient for who? She didn't answer. But as she stood up to leave, she added quietly, your grandmother wasn't like the others. That night, my family started calling. Not one person, one after another. The first said I was being too sensitive. The second said I was becoming obsessive.
The third said I was hurting my grandmother by dragging up old issues. They all shared the same message. I wasn't close enough to understand. And because of that, I didn't have the right to question anything. When I mentioned the letter, the responses came fast. You're overthinking it. She probably had someone write it for her. You're remembering things wrong. Each comment was delivered gently, almost kindly, but they stacked on top of each other, not to convince me they were right, but to make me wonder whether I was the one losing perspective. The moment that finally broke it was when my aunt said, "Are you even sure you remember her handwriting correctly?" I hung up. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was scared, but because I realized this wasn't just about my grandmother anymore. It was a system, one that worked perfectly as long as everyone spoke for the one person who wasn't allowed to speak at all. The next morning, I returned to the nursing home.
I didn't ask to see her. I asked about their mail procedures. The manager explained that all correspondence was monitored for safety reasons. I asked whether my grandmother was allowed to send mail out. He answered immediately, only with the guardian's approval. I smiled, thanked him, and walked out. That was when it clicked. The letter in my pocket wasn't just proof that my grandmother was still lucid. It was a mistake, a tiny crack in a story that had been constructed too carefully. And if there was one crack,
there would be others. I stopped asking my family, not because they knew more than I did, but because every answer they gave led to the same place. Doctors, files, a legal guardian, a closed loop where I always arrived last. So I changed direction. If every decision had been signed for her, if every financial move had been handled by the book, then there was only one place where the truth couldn't lie forever. The bank. I didn't go as a family member. I went as an ordinary customer, asking ordinary questions. How signatures are verified, when guardianship takes effect, what triggers an account to be flagged. The teller answered calmly, professionally, but when I asked about signatures, she paused, just for a moment. Signatures are the hardest thing to fake, she said, not because of how they look, but because of habits. At home, I laid everything out on the table. The letter. Old greeting cards. A copy of a contract my grandmother had signed years ago. I wasn't looking for similarities. I was looking for patterns. The way she always tilted one letter slightly. How she placed periods too close to the word before them. A tiny hesitation at the end of her signature that you'd miss unless you stared long enough. Those habits were in the letter. They were missing from the documents my family claimed she had signed while unfit. That was when I clicked. Not every signature was fake. They just weren't hers. One detail in the letter stood out again. She had mentioned the bank by its old name, a name I knew they'd changed years ago, but she had never gotten used to the new one. I checked the timeline. The branch had operated under that name until the merger. Even after the rebrand, the internal system kept the old code for a while. Someone who wasn't mentally present wouldn't remember that. Someone who had banked there for decades would. I called the bank again. This time, I asked about accounts that had been reviewed further. No names, just reasons. Usually it's because the signature doesn't fully match, the representative said. Or the signer can't answer habit-based verification questions. Habits. I thought back to every time my grandmother signed paperwork when she was healthy. She always paused first. Not out of hesitation, but because she reread the final line, even if she'd already read it once. Digging through her belongings, I found an old handwritten note. Years old. Not about money, just a reminder she'd written to herself. Always reread the last line. I went back to the nursing home. This time, I wasn't looking for her. I asked about staff schedules, old shifts, who was usually present when she was assisted with paperwork. The answers came slowly, not because they didn't know,
But because they weren't used to being questioned that way.
Everything goes through the guardian, they said. I wrote down dates. Then I compared them to the transaction records. There were days she never left her room. Days she was marked as fatigued or non-communicative. And yet, signatures appeared. That wasn't suspicion anymore. That was a timeline that couldn't exist. That night, my family called again. This time, their voices weren't calm. They asked who I had spoken to. They asked what I had asked. They said I was going too far. I didn't argue. I asked one question. If everything is proper and legal, why are you afraid of me asking? No one answered. I organized what I had, cleanly. No thick folders, no accusations, just facts that couldn't be explained away. The letter, signatures that didn't match her habits, the old bank name, dates that didn't align with her physical condition. I didn't need to prove she was fully lucid. I only needed to prove she was lucid enough not to sign those documents.
The next day, I scheduled a meeting at the bank, not to withdraw money, but to ask a question I knew no one else could answer for her. The bank meeting room was quieter than I expected. No visible tension, no raised voices, just a table, 3 chairs, and people who believed everything was under control. The legal guardian sat across from me, calm, confident, his documents neatly arranged. He spoke for my grandmother the way he had for the past 2 years. All transactions were legal, he said. Proper signatures, medical clearance. The bank representative nodded, following procedure. I didn't argue. I placed the letter on the table. "This is my grandmother's handwriting," I said, "written 3 days ago." The guardian glanced at it briefly, then looked away. "She's been writing nonsense for a long time." I nodded, then slid another document forward. "And this," I said, "is the signature used to withdraw her money. These 2 signatures don't match. Not in appearance, in habit. The bank representative paused, this time longer. I spoke slowly. My grandmother always reread the last line before signing.
She always stopped right here. I pointed to a tiny break in the signature on the letter. But that pause doesn't exist on the transaction records. No one spoke. I pushed the final document forward. This is her daily activity log at the nursing home, I said. On these dates, she never left her room. She was listed as fatigued, non-communicative. I looked up, yet her signature appears at the bank. The room went silent. The bank representative closed the folder. We need to suspend all transactions immediately, she said, and initiate an independent review. The guardian opened his mouth, then stopped. I stood up. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. Before I left, I said one last thing. I didn't come here to take money. I came to give my grandmother back the right to speak through her own signature. The glass door closed behind me, and for the first time in 2 years, no one could speak for her anymore. Some people lose their voice not because they've lost their mind, but because someone else doesn't want them heard. Justice doesn't always begin with a courtroom or a verdict. Sometimes it starts by giving one person back the right to speak for themselves.